like to introduce Tia Orris Peters and Alex Gonzalez from Seventh Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples. And they will be providing some introductory remarks around the Thriving Women's Program. Tia and Alex, welcome.
Thank you, Hester. Hello to everyone here. Thank you, Hester Dillon, for Reverse Consulting, for all of our work together and for your words to start us off today in a good way. My name is Tia Orris Peters. I'm Shiwi, and I serve as the CEO of the Seventh Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples. I'm calling in from Wiyot Territory, what some people know as Northern California. Redwoods and, redwoods and ocean, rivers, deer, hawks, condors. Our organization emerged in 1977 out of the dreams and memories, the aspirations, and the intentions of generations of our ancestors who made good decisions for our survival and for our futurity so we could be here today. And who, through our founders in 1977, intentionally put into motion an identity-based organization, a native identity-based organization, focused, concentrated on supporting community-generated initiatives that grow from seeds into forests, coming from a place of love and respect, of assets, not weakness, life affirming, to engage in self-determined philanthropy. Our purpose as Seventh Generation Fund, our role and our responsibility is to, is to mobilize positive energy through our grant making, through capacity building, movement building, and leadership, to help resource, to nurture, to support grassroots first responders who are working to heal, revitalize, and restore their peoples, cultures, and homelands, to be good ancestors. Core to our work is the belief in the inherent strength and capacity of Indigenous women. We who create, nurture, guide communities along pathways of action toward safety and toward well-being, toward empowerment, toward liberation, individually and collectively. We believe that a way for philanthropy to be a good ancestor at this time, more than ever, is to be in right relation with Indigenous peoples, to support Indigenous women, is to help seed and support work that emanates from and centers Indigenous women and girl-led solution-based strategies for healthy, vibrant communities. The Thriving Women's Program is transnational in scope and directly engages and supports work that secures healing and well-being today and the sacred birthright of our future generations for tomorrow, for a more just and livable world. I want to thank you for being an aligned collaborator for Indigenous peoples, for your support, and for joining us today in this conversation. Before I go on, I want to make sure to recognize and appreciate our co-sponsors for this convening. Amanda Kostler, who was our initiating donor when we formalized Thriving Women within this organization, and Geo Family Foundation, Grantmakers for Girls of Color, Hopa Mountain, Humboldt Area Foundation, Calliopeia Foundation, Moon Jaguar Strategies, the Ms. Foundation for Women, Solidaire Network, and the Tamalpais Trust. So if we can go to one of the slides, the one that's fine. Formally launched in July 17th, 2015, the Thriving Women Program is a manifestation of the belief in Native women and girls, in their intrinsic power, in their visioning put into action. It identifies and challenges, and it disrupts the ongoing oppression and exploitation that continue to harm our families, communities, and nations. It helps build dynamic, multi-generational, interconnected power, systems of support, and thriving as part of a global movement for comprehensive social justice and transformation. It is dreamed, created, and led by Indigenous women. Here in this slide, you can see that these are the two primary components. We've got four primary components. This is reclaiming a world without violence against women and girls, dismantling settler colonial patriarchy. We know that the violence against Indigenous women and girls is an expression of violence against the earth, that supporting Indigenous women and girls for a peaceful and safe world is the best mechanism to create change. Rebuilding and strengthening the systems that Indigenous women and girls have done for centuries is the best way to create positive change, not only for our communities, but for world peace. Birthkeeping, motherhood, and kinship is core to Indigenous existence and futurity. Honoring and underscoring Native women as the hearts and backbones, as the visionaries and leaders in Indigenous communities through matriarchy and through strengthening multi-generational kinship systems is a highlighted strategy throughout this entire program area. Next slide, please. Cultural continuity is the third component of the work that we support. And all of these are interwoven together like a basket. They twine together. None of them can be pulled apart. But when we think about Native identity and family wellness, community empowerment, and how those nurture nationhood, these are the framework that forms the structure of that very basket. It supports and repairs and restores intergenerational transmission of knowledge, language revitalization, traditional food systems, healing remedies, coming of age ceremonies, and supporting Indigenous concepts of gender expression, love, and respect. Finally, the rights of Mother Earth. This is a transcending program or transcending concept that goes throughout all of our programming, but it's definitely emerged more lately with our work here in Thriving Women. It recognizes Indigenous peoples' direct and intimate and interconnected relationship with Mother Earth and the natural world, and how violence is perpetrated against the land, how it echoes, reverberates, and mirrors in the body's violence against Native women and girls. Supporting Native women-led strategies that centers a gender framework for social and ecological justice, protects and restores natural resources and systems, and nurtures thriving life for family. This particular component of the work intersects with our work with land defenders and water protectors, with community vitality, and with the Flickr Fund. So thank you for letting me share these 4 components and to introduce a little bit about the Thriving Women program. I'd like to introduce Alex Gonzalez. She'll be sharing many more details and specifics about this work, and then we'll hear from more of our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Tia, and thank you everyone for attending our funders briefing today. I'm thrilled to be here and excited to share more about our Thriving Women program. Some examples, next slide, please. Some examples of Thriving Women projects that we support include but are not limited to revitalizing coming of age ceremonies, MMIW awareness and the connection between extractive industries and violence against Indigenous women, birthkeeping and reproductive health, engaging in multi-generational mentorship, providing culturally relevant counseling and crisis services, frontline action to address threats to the well-being of Mother Earth, and exploring women's roles in traditional food systems. Thriving Women has evolved from an initiative to a program and has paved the way for a specific component launched in January 2021, Grants for Girls Vitality, which funds projects created, led by, and serving young Indigenous women and girls in Native Alaska, Native Hawaii, and the lower 48. Since its creation almost 6 years ago, Thriving Women has funded a total of 110 projects, with our most recent being awarded 6 days ago on April 2nd, 2021. As of today, there are still 62 proposals to the Thriving Women program that are to be determined within the next month, an estimated $2 million in requests from US projects and $200,000 from global projects. So far, we have reached 8 countries, 5 continents, and 355 tribal nations around the world. The 7th Generation Fund has awarded a total of $2,814,199.15 through Thriving Women. Here we have 2 pie charts explaining the amount of grants funded under each of our 4 Thriving Women pathways. This is representative of our 110 projects funded between December 2015 and April 2021. We also have total funds allocated towards each pathway, with the majority going to violence response and prevention projects at a little over 1.1 million of our total 2.8 million in funding. This shows that domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and MMIW are and continue to be significant concerns in our communities. Next slide. Thank you. The final pie chart shows the amount of grants per region. The majority of our Thriving Women projects are within the so-called US, with 87% total in combined regions, and 13% being allocated towards global projects. We are extremely thankful to the Tamalpais Trust for their support of Thriving Women Global and the issues that impact Indigenous women here in the US also reach worldwide. There is much support needed for Indigenous women-led projects globally. Finally, I wanted to end our Thriving Women program overview with some facts to contextualize the experiences of Indigenous women today. According to the Institute for Women's Policy Research, in 2019, Native women working full-time in the US were paid on average 59.7 cents for every $1 a white man made in a similar role. This is a difference of approximately $24,656 per year. It is important to note that this is an average number, as in some states, the wage gap between Indigenous women and white men is much larger. I also wanted to include this information because we always hear about the gender pay gap being 87 cents to the dollar, but that's a number that reflects white women, and this isn't the experience of women of color or Indigenous women. According to a study conducted by the National Congress of American Indians Policy Research Center, 56.1% of Native women have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime, and 96% have reported that the perpetrator was non-Native. This is important to know when we talk about not only the ongoing effects of colonization, but also the connection between missing and murdered Indigenous women and extractive industries, as well as court rulings like Oliphant v. Suquamish Indian Tribe, 1978, a Supreme Court case which ruled that non-natives couldn't be prosecuted by tribes for crimes committed on tribal lands. Lastly, I wanted to end on a positive note and share about something we've seen emerging in some of our Thriving Women proposals, the revitalization of women's traditional tattoos. There has been a huge movement throughout the Indigenous world to reclaim and revitalize women's traditional tattooing, including in the Arctic and Pacific Northwest, as a way to honor ancestors, celebrate womanhood, mark the beginning of a milestone, and so much more. Thank you all again for attending our Voices Around the Circle Thriving Women Funders briefing. It has been an honor to present to you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Alex, for sharing about the Thriving Women program and the breadth and depth of the work that's taking place in so many communities. OCO again, and warm greetings, friends and relatives. As Tia mentioned, and I mentioned earlier, my name is Hester Dillon. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm based in the traditional territory of the Shoshone-Bannock, also known today as Southwest Montana, so-called Southwest Montana. I'm very glad to be a part of this Voices Around the Circle Thriving Women with Seventh Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples today. Seventh Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples decided to host this series of conversations with philanthropic funders and donors in conjunction with other conversations that have been happening in Indigenous communities, particularly in light of COVID-19. Voices Around the Circle is one such series, and Seventh Generation Fund wanted to widen the circle as well as content to include people from the philanthropic sector, charitable foundations, and donor advisory institutions, hence the series title. Tia and Alex's remarks highlight how much important and diverse Thriving Women work is taking place. It takes place in spite of and in response to colonization and its ongoing effects. In Indigenous communities, the practice of culture and the struggle to retain culture are intertwined. The ability to care for our relatives and our territories is part of this. Some may see Indigenous peoples as quaint. Think drumming and dancing. The struggles Indigenous peoples face may not be fully seen or understood since our peoples and our histories are not accurately portrayed in many parts of American life. There are many present-day efforts to rebuild and retain cultural practices, though. Innovation is everywhere, and there are struggles. There is a very real struggle to not lose our relatives right now. The high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit relatives, as well as the pandemic, provide stark reminders. Communities resist pipelines, border walls, mining, and more. The freedom of safety, or to give birth as generations before have done, may not yet be available to some relatives. It was lost to many in generations before due to colonization, and yet people resisted. A few months back, I spoke with an elder from Alaska, and she spoke about the importance of beauty. She mentioned that you can make a functional basket or bowl, or you can embellish it, which is what people did, she said. There was a desire of the people for beauty. And I think you see that in the slides, just as one example here this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're located. Mother Earth provides the materials to make beautiful things with. So making that basket or bowl is practicing culture. Our relatives remember as well as innovate on traditional practices. Culture continues. It is survivance, as Anishinaabe writer Gerald Bisner calls it. Bisner writes that Native survivance is an active sense of presence over absence, deracination, and oblivion. Survivance is the continuance of stories. So the acts of carrying on culture and innovating on it, resistance, resilience, and survivance are intertwined. Our efforts to remain strong and have thriving communities are intertwined. Today, you'll hear examples of this braid of resilience, resistance, and beauty from a variety of programs around the globe. You'll also hear from people who are supporting it. In the materials sent out yesterday, you received several links to articles, reports, and a video. Some feature the work of panelists that you'll hear from shortly. The materials visually and in written words illustrate this braid. They provide information and highlight crucial work from grassroots efforts to the federal work recently launched by Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland. I hope you'll have time to enjoy them if you haven't already. One note before we move into hearing from our speakers. If you have a question, please put it in the chat and the 7th Generation Fund team will be working to respond to those questions. And if for some reason we're not able to respond to your question in the chat during this webinar, please know that it will be noted and someone from 7th Generation Fund will follow up with you directly. So to begin with our first speaker, I'd like to introduce Maria del Carmen Paricano. She is Executive Director of the Siwapatli Collective in Phoenix. Siwapatli translates in English to women's medicine. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, actually, it's not allowing me to share my screen. So if I'm able to get access to that. But I just want to say, Mashpancinco, Nueva York, no toca María del Carmen Paricano. Tasocamarti, Tonancintlali, Tasocamarti, Nonantzin, María Cristina Parra Martinez, Tasocamarti, Nonantzin, Autumn Territory, Tasocamarti, Siwapatli Collective, Tasocamarti, all your lineages and relatives. Just thank you for this opportunity to share with each of you about the Siwapatli Collective. We actually came together as an organization in 2015 out of the call for support. As a new mom for myself, my mother had recently passed away, and I had one baby at home, and then I had a second one and felt completely lost and didn't know what to do. Part of that was, again, mourning that loss, but then seeing how we as urban indigenous women in Phoenix didn't feel like we had the support systems in place to help our families heal from these generational traumas. And so we started meeting in coffee shops, and it was all just very organic, not anything really specific, until one day we thought, how can we heal our bodies? How can we continue to heal our souls? And so the collective then established a 501c3, and we just kept growing from there and continuing trying to spread the message of healing to for all Indigenous women. Our mission here, many of us have known each other for the past 20 to 30 years, depending, many from different ceremonial circles, prayed together essentially, and that really solidified our bonds as comadres, what we call co-mothers, as community members. And so our mission is to provide healing for Indigenous women and their families. This is done by sharing stories, connecting resources, revitalizing traditional knowledge and wisdom, and by promoting health and wellness. We were very fortunate to have been trusted by many of our elders from surrounding communities, and being told, they were very open and saying, this is the work that needs to happen, and now go do it, so very felt privileged and honored to have that responsibility. Our structure, just like I mentioned, being very just tied to the way we function as Indigenous women in an urban setting. We put our pillars of spirituality, knowledge, keep sharing and keeping, and community in the forefront. We have a circle of founding members who are then also make up our board of directors and our nonprofit structure. And then we also have our consejo circle, or elder council, who we seek guidance from and try to work with very, very closely and support them, as well as we know that our elders need the utmost support during these times as well. And then we have our comadritas, which we use a promotora model or health promoter model to try to help educate community members when it comes to different things. You see here what we call our cuatro flechas, or our 4 arrows knowledge of model for community sharing. And it's all intertwined, just as Tia had mentioned, that basket, that loom, that what we use, our rebozo, that holds our items together. And this is pretty much how our organization, our group, our collective functions. Everything's interwoven. We also love to share our collective code, and just really seeing how we as urban Indigenous women place our altars first. We operate at the pace of our families, listen with an open heart and mind, respect agreed upon shared time and space, honor each other's personal healing journey and how we could do that as a community, communicate appropriately with clarity, kindness, and align to agreed upon topics, and trusting her story, our story, what we created, each other, decisions made in our own healing process. And just, weaving together our work, we have been very fortunate with the support of Thriving Women to bring greater awareness specifically to our ancestral womb wellness gathering that touches on so many aspects of wellbriety within us and within our bodies, being able to share different coming of age stories, how to heal or how to support one another during birth, during pregnancy, the birthing process, and then postpartum, which we know is an overlapping, and for a lot of people, it takes a really long time to heal from that process. So just really being able to share knowledge from, this past year, we were very fortunate to have had people from our Artam relatives share, our Yaqui relatives share, as well as an elder from San Diego, from Kumeyaay land, shared about their process. And so it was really beautiful just to see the commonalities for the coming of age ceremonies themselves. Many herbalists or traditional healers also shared their time about how to best heal our bodies and heal our minds. And with that traditional knowledge sharing, we also do try to connect deeply with our elders in different settings. Some of us traveled down to Teotihuacan to keep learning, continue learning, and continue spreading that knowledge here to our urban Indigenous relatives. These are just some of the workshops that we've held, now being in this virtual setting. A lot of our work was in person, and now shifting that to provide information on healing. Myself, I'm also a chef, and so a lot of the work I do is about healing, supporting through food and using food as medicine. And so being able to help educate community about that and help share recipes. Also creating that space so folks could have, in different focuses of, during these times, we have a lot of the feelings of loss and grief within our community. So really trying to speak to that as well and supporting our community the best we can. We were also very fortunate to have been, to participate in giving back to our community during these COVID times in supporting through our Indigenous food packages. We were able to, and learning and sharing about first foods for a lot of the mothers who have been, I don't know, there have been many impacted by the PIMC or Phoenix Indian Medical Center closure here in Phoenix. Many families were turned away, didn't have anywhere to birth. And so we've been able to support them not only through dry goods and food, but also through supporting the establishment of our collective birth fund, which we do through our birth justice work, and being able to support birth workers to support these families, as well as providing some financial support for them after they receive medical bills that they weren't expecting from the Indian Health Services. So, and the hospital settings. Our birth fund did support 13 urban Indigenous families, 10 birth workers of color impacted by colonial systems and the PIMC closure from different backgrounds, different nations in the city. We also have our advocacy work, which we are currently still trying to fight one of the local doula bills that has been proposed in the Arizona legislature to reimburse doula work or birth workers in the support setting. But our opposition to it is because it's not a livable wage, and they're not counting our traditional birth workers or traditional healers in that process as well. So really trying to see how we could advocate as a community for those who are doing this work. We've also built relationships with other community coalitions in the area regarding birth work and birth advocacy. We did put together a small community feedback report regarding our process at our Ancestral Womb Wellness Gathering, where we were able to survey birth workers and say what works for you, what doesn't, what do you need as a community? How can we support you to continue sustaining these traditional braids of healing when it comes to birth support and postpartum? And then a lot of the feedback we received was also around, a lot of birth workers are mothers or parents, and how can we support them in the long run as well? And so in that brief time, because of course I could speak for hours on everything we do, but I just want to say thank you, touching briefly on all different aspects and layers of our work. But I appreciate the support of 7th Generation Fund, and as well as the community of women, who aren't here presently. Really want to acknowledge them, acknowledge our lineages, acknowledge our ancestors, and acknowledge the healing that it's taken for many of us to get to this point. So I appreciate you all. Thank you.
Bueno, Maria, thank you for telling us so much about your work and its many, many aspects, especially given such a short period of time. Bueno. I'd now like to introduce Charlene Akpik. She is Executive Director of Data for Indigenous Justice. The materials list you received links to their recently released report on MMIWG in Alaska. Welcome, Charlene.
Koyana uvlalo takwise and anupak. Good morning. I'm going to share my screen here. Are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes.
And you're seeing not the presenter's view?
Yep, it looks great.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be sharing about Data for Indigenous Justice, which is the nonprofit which homes the database for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Alaska. Uvanga Charlene Akpik, Anupaxis ka Akpik, Chinik Mugurunga, Sulina Tirvik Mugurunga, Akaka Sandra Baby Lu Akpik, Ilkneka Evan Luklan, Savaktunga Data for Indigenous Justice Me. So good morning, my name is Charlene Akpik and my Inupiaq name is Akpik, which is salmonberry or cloudberry. It also means in our language to be confident. My family is from the Bering Strait region, from villages of Gullivan and White Mountain, which have less than 200 people in them and which are not on a road service. The picture there you can see you have to fly to our community. My mother, Sandra Baby Lu Akpik, and I have a son who's now 6 years old. His name is Evan Luklan. I am a learner of my Inupiaq language, and I am a singer and dancer with the Kinship dance group. And I'm the co-founding executive director of Data for Indigenous Justice. Before we get going into some of the work that we do, I wanted to gently remind ourselves that as oftentimes we share about data or research, that it can feel desensitized. But we know that when we do this work, that these are real women, real children, real loved ones that are missing from our communities. Their lost hopes, their lost dreams, their lost broken family intergenerational connections. So oftentimes, again, when we talk about data and research, it can feel like we're just talking about numbers, but we know that these numbers are real people and real loved ones that are missing from our communities. Also, before I go on, I want to share that I am a survivor of violence and that I've lost my mother, who you saw on the previous slide to this topic. I've lost my auntie, my cousin. We've lost way too many, and that each one is one too many. If this is a new topic area for you, I just wanted to provide a very brief overview. I'll be sharing from the Alaska context today, but this is a nationwide crisis, and it's actually a global crisis. We see this happening also in Canada and our relatives across the globe. It can feel like it's a very complex issue, but really what it comes down to is that this is an issue from colonization. Many people ask how long I've been doing this work. I am a survivor of colonization. I've been doing this work since the moment I was born into this earth. Some of the specific areas that can be talked about, and I'm happy to answer questions on, in understanding the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people, is that we lack protections. There are no protections for us as Indigenous women. There's no accountability to keeping us safe through law enforcement and other agencies. We are also missing in data, and I'll share, that's what I'll be focusing on today and what my organization focuses on. But we've gone missing in data as well. And we're also missing in media. The Urban Indian Health Institute put out a report in 2018 that shared about the ways that we're missing in data. And when we have missing loved ones, it goes untalked about and we're unseen. Up here in Alaska, a couple years ago, we decided to have a rally that would bring attention to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So we were planning an event with grassroots organizers. And part of that rally and event was that we wanted to name and call the loved ones from our communities that were missing. So we went to find and pull a report, only to find that there was no report. There was no tracking. There was no way to even have those names for us to call on. So at that rally, grassroots organizers, we decided to take it upon ourselves to start pulling those names with our community. And our community started giving us the names to take care of and to steward. And that began the hard work of homing the database for Alaska of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So we've been doing this work and tracking for a couple of years, but our organization is not yet 1 year old. We officially became incorporated during the pandemic of all times in 2020, April of 2020, later this month. And I'm really grateful and honored to have this work is Indigenous led. It's led by Indigenous women. And I want to recognize my board, Jody Potts, who has a background in law enforcement, Abigail Echohawk, who does amazing work in research, and Dr. Malia Villegas, who has a background in policy. So I have a really amazing board. I also have an advisory board made up of elders, healers, lawyers, and youth. So data for Indigenous justice. Again, sometimes the words data and research can kind of make you cringe if you're from an Indigenous community, because we recognize that the history of research from outsiders has been oftentimes very harmful. And so we have a very specific purpose at Data for Indigenous Justice to reclaim our data and to use it to benefit our people. And so this is, again, very different than the way that outside research has often been done. So we know that when we are talking about numbers, when we're talking about stories, that we are taking care of those and that we're stewarding them. We also do this work very much and very closely with and for our community. Here are some pictures pre-COVID about some of the things that we do with our community. We've had a vigil, another one coming up May 5th, of course, for National Awareness Day of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, where we host a vigil and a heartbeat of the drums. So drumming is a really important part of many of our cultures, and we come together with drumming and song. We've hosted beading workshops like you'll see on the right. We've done painting. We've done vigils. We've passed local resolutions. We've written legislative bills and many other things. And currently right now, Data for Indigenous Justice is building a canoe to honor and dedicate to our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls for May 5th. So right now we have a canoe building workshop that Data for Indigenous Justice is putting on with our community. So over the last couple of years, we began that hard work of homing our database for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls a couple of years ago. At the time in 2018, the Urban Indian Health Institute had put out the first nationwide report, and Alaska had stood at 52 cases. And at that time, we were the 4th highest state, with Anchorage having the 3rd highest rates, and that's in sheer number of cases in the whole nation. And that's not per population. Since we've been homing and tracking just in the last couple of years, and we put out this report in February of 2021, we have reclaimed a total of 229 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls here in Alaska. 149 of them are as missing and 80 as murdered. And we know, sadly, that this is just the beginning of what we're able to track. So, for example, some of the local law enforcement databases which we pull from are only digitized from 2013 on. So this is just, quote, the tip of the iceberg. This can feel like very heavy work, and it's very sobering to have these numbers, but we know that it's very powerful too. This is the first report that we're able to have to actually inform policy and decision makers that are going to impact the accountability and the change that we need up here in Alaska and across our Indigenous communities. This work is an example of what it means to decolonize data and to have data sovereignty, to self-determine what this looks like in our community and to use it for our benefit. And finally, I just want to thank everyone for all of the support. This has been so important for our organization to be able to mobilize and partner up here in Alaska. There's a lot of partners that we work with in this work to create change. And I'm really proud to work in partnership, and I'm really thankful for all of the support. And that although this feels, again, like a heavy topic, we do this work because it's life affirming. We do this work because we vision and see a healthy and safe future for our future generations. And we do this work because we want to thrive. Koyana.
Wato, Charlene, thank you for telling us about the work that you all are doing and sharing about the report as well. I'd next like to introduce Teresa Younger. She's president and CEO of Ms. Foundation for Women, and Ms. supports thriving women. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be able to be part of this conversation, and I want to thank my fellow presenters for their amazing information that you've shared today. Thank you so much, and to all of those at Seventh Generations, thank you for having me be part of the conversation today. What I wanted to lift up was simply a report that we have recently been working on at the Ms. Foundation and some of the work that we hope to continue to do. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to support thriving women and the interconnectedness of the work that you are able to support and lift up. Interconnection is one of the key values of the Ms. Foundation. We believe that those closest to the work, those most impacted are those closest to the work, and we want to support those efforts as we move forward. Many of you know the Ms. Foundation has been around for nearly 50 years now and has been supporting grassroots movement building for almost that entire time. Our work is about building women's collective power in the United States and in the US territories to advance equity and justice for all. We do believe that we believe in a safe and just world where power and possibility are not limited by race, gender, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, or age. We believe that equity and inclusion are the cornerstones of a true democracy in which the worth and value of every person, value, and dignity of every person is valued. This work, which I have been doing with the foundation now for nearly 6.5 years, has been something that is very close to my heart. I want to just lift up that the complexities of our lives are intertwined in so many ways. I grew up in North Dakota, part of the Sioux and Lakota tribes. My father was in the military and is Blackfoot, and I am in the process of aligning with my tribal affiliation, and very excited about that. When I got to the Ms. Foundation, I had known of its long history supporting Indigenous women and was very excited about the opportunity to both sit at the intersection of race and gender and identity in the work that I was going to be doing and leading our efforts. We had talked for so long about what was missing in philanthropy as a whole in terms of data and information, and the information that's been shared today has been so valuable. Just last year, we released a new report called Pocket Change: How Women and Girls of Color Are Doing More with Less. This was a very intentional report that interviewed and looked at over 2,000 different organizations led by women and girls in this country, and really broke it out by race and by gender and by state and by areas of interest. What we found in that report is what we've heard actually so far, which is we know that so much work is getting done with very little resources, and those all of those activities are multi-strategy and multi-issues. So while philanthropy has traditionally tried to silo activities of the organizations they want to fund, we know that both through Pocket Change as well as through the work of Seventh Generations and Thriving Women, that our work is not siloed. our work is so intertwined. We cannot do one without the other. And we saw that to be true in the work that we, in the testing that we did. So I wanted to lift up some pieces of the report. The report was shared with you, but I'm also going to share with you the, if I can get a screen share so that I can just share a part of our report, I'll be able to share that with you also. So I just wanted to lift up the report itself, and hopefully you all can see some components of pocket change. There are fact sheets in the pocket change report. What we know is that of the billions of dollars that philanthropy is moving, $365 million are going to women and girls of color. And about 9 million of those dollars are specifically benefiting Indigenous women and girls, which is 2.6% of the less than 0.5% of philanthropic dollars that are going to women and girls in total. What we found also was that the average size grant to Indigenous women and girl-led organizations was about $30,000, and across the board, it was about $35,000 that foundations were making to Indigenous women and girls serving organizations. The reason why this is so important is that it reinforces the fact that work is getting done and there's a lack of trust within philanthropy to support and fund women and girls of color, Indigenous women and girls. And I just wanted to lift that up. Please use it how you see fit in the work that you are trying to do. Some of the other pieces of the report that we found were most interesting was of the data points that we put together, 62.5% of the organizations, of Indigenous organizations, are led by women and girls. We also found, I'm just going to leave it on this slide for a moment, we also found that there were lots of common themes around the work that our sisters were doing in this field, much around health equity, education and employment, and economic justice, which we've just heard about. In addition, we know that there are no single strategies to getting the work done. So we saw common strategies also around service delivery, community organizing, and base building, and voter registration. This work is also reinforced in another report that we have had worked on about building power, which looks at the lack of political power that is happening with Indigenous women in their communities, and making sure that we are looking to fund that. And I'll talk about that in a moment. The other part of the report that I wanted to lift up as part of the conversation today was really that more than a quarter of all of the Indigenous women and girl-led organizations have less than $50,000 in their budgets. And they're doing exactly what we just heard, which is they're doing the work without having any of the dollars to do it. Our commitment at the Ms. Foundation for Women is intentionally to lift up and amplify work so that we can drive more dollars to women and girls of color, including our Indigenous women and girls, in the work that we are trying to do. We did a state-by-state breakdown. So just in comparison, overall across the country, including the US territories, women and girls are, philanthropy is allocating about $5.48 for each woman and girl of color. This slide that I have pulled up, and I'm just going to increase it slightly so you can see, is a breakdown of how many foundation dollars are going to Indigenous women and girls in 2017. These numbers will have slightly altered. Obviously, 2020 was an amazing year for so many, but you can still see how few dollars overall are going to our Indigenous communities and the work that is getting done. And the complexity of that work that is getting done. We're absolutely committed to lifting this up and changing this in multiple ways. We also, because at the Ms. Foundation, we provide general operating support, not project support, we are recognizing the importance of those complexities of what is happening in the field and on the ground, and how that needs to continue to be moved, how that needs to continue to move forward, and how we need to increase these numbers. Out of our pocket change report, we had 3 things that came out. One was name it, we realized that many members of the philanthropic community are actually not naming that they are providing dollars to specific communities. And so we are challenging philanthropy to name what they are doing and to then intentionally invite people in to the conversations, to track how many dollars or lack thereof are going to our Indigenous sisters, and then to increase it. And what does that look like for increasing? The way the Ms. Foundation is doing that is this past year, we were also part of a conversation that looked at an assessment conversation that we are doing right now, which is an Indigenous women's reproductive justice assessment, which is looking at the breadth of what is happening in reproductive justice around Indigenous communities and how we can increase what is happening. And we heard from both from Maria earlier today about the complexities that we are talking about. And we know through what Thriving Women is doing that it is not just about birthing justice, it is also about all of the complexities and the healing that needs to take place in order for communities to thrive and be as centered as they can be. We also, so that is one, that report will be coming out in the next, probably in the next 3 to 6 months, probably sooner for some internal conversations. But the idea is to then go back to philanthropy, to go back to the reproductive justice community and the birthing justice community and start intentionally asking them to move more dollars to our Indigenous communities for the work that they are trying to do and how they can do it. And then to also reinforce that those dollars need support for some of the policy work that is going on, in addition to some of the programmatic work that is going on. And so I'll talk about our Building Power report in a moment. We've also at the Ms. Foundation for Women been given a grant by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which has not been very, what's the word I'm looking for? They're far more conservative in how they make their grants than how we have done it traditionally at the Ms. Foundation. So we're pushing at the edges with them to support work of a BIPOC, birth justice, dollars going into the field. And our commitment at the Ms. Foundation is to really look at those places and states that have the least amount of dollars moving in that area and to start funding in those areas to support the work of birth justice also. So I'm sure we will be seeing many of you in some of those further conversations. The way we've been able to design both the Indigenous Women's Reproductive Justice Assessment and the BIPOC birth justice work that we're doing with Robert Wood Johnson has been by listening to the grassroots. So we do not do participatory grant making, but we do participatory design work. And so in order for us to do our assessment, we did pull together and hosted conversations and roundtables of conversations with about 6 to 10 folks. Tia was amongst them, as we were able to really listen and pull out and call out what we were hearing in terms of what is needed in the field by our Indigenous sisters and the work that you are all trying to do. And we're committed to lifting that up and moving more money and more dollars into that space. The one thing I just wanted to lift up before we go is like the inclusive in the language that we talk about when we talk about women, we are also talking about girls, gender nonconforming, two-spirit. It's inclusive in our work. When we talk about the funding that we do at the Ms. Foundation in the United States, that includes the US territories. And I just want to be really specific because sometimes people are like, well, you didn't say it, but we are saying it. For us, it is inclusive of also our trans siblings, and it is all part of it. And in fact, what we found when in the Pocket Change report overall was that 70% of the organizations that we were working with or that we were talking to included two-spirited, transgender, gender non-conforming folks in their work, and did not make that distinction, did not make any distinctions about who they were trying to serve and what that looks like. And we're sitting in a space of most inclusiveness, not the least inclusive spaces. And the last piece I wanted to just lift up was the fact that the Ms. Foundation for Women is also has also put together a report that looks at policy initiatives and where dollars are going and not going when it comes to policy change. And I will tell you this, although you already know this, Indigenous communities have the least, are getting the least funding for policy initiatives of any community in the United States. And our funding at the Ms. Foundation is predominantly in the United States. So that's how I can give you that data. We have a C4 called the Ms. Action Fund, and that fund will be targeted specifically at supporting Indigenous women and the policies that need to take place in those communities. And we're very excited about that, and we'll be lifting that work up in the very near future. So the Ms. Foundation for Women is completely committed and in partnership to the work that is going on, both with Seven Generations and the Thriving Women. And I couldn't be any prouder to be in partnership, sisterhood with all of you. And thank you so much for having us on the call today.
Well, Teresa, I'm really appreciating the data that you spoke about, as well as the details around that data, and also just reflecting on that wage information that Alex shared as we began. And so thinking about how that work really just does continue, often unsupported, and how it could really be enhanced. So thanks for that. I'd now like to introduce Aviya Lynya. She's spokesperson of children at the National Advocacy Institution for Children's Rights in Greenland. Welcome, Aviya.
Aviya, I think your sound is off. There you go.
All right, yeah. I think the PowerPoint should get up somehow. Thank you very much. And you can just take the next. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this honor to be part of this amazing group of women. My name is Aviya. I'm an Inuk. You can just go back. Yeah. My name is Aviya. I'm an Inuk from Greenland. I'm a granddaughter, daughter, mother, wife. I'm a fisherwoman. I'm a tradition teacher. I'm a social anthropologist, human rights activist, and also a leader. Greenlandic is my mother tongue, and I'm one of the few being lucky to have Danish and English languages as well, so I could have a further education. Around half of any people in Greenland do not have further education than the elementary school because of the colonial educational system. I'm part of the story that many Indigenous people share, being brought up filled with love, but also a lot of trauma. And I also been living with the clashes between the cultures, different cultures all my life, but I'm also very resilient. So the women and the girls that I fight for are as much my own story as well. To give a little context of Greenland, if we can take the next slide. Well, first of all, I can say that I'm the leader of the National Child Rights Advocate Institution in Greenland. We are only 6 women working in the institution, and we don't have much funding to cover the whole work, but we do what we can to do our required work, which is to monitor the legislation and practice if they are in accordance with the obligations that Greenland has under the UN Convention on the Right of the Child. And at the same time, since we are an Indigenous population, so the Indigenous people's rights is also part of our work. We assess the conditions under which children in Greenland live, and Also, we communicate about the lives of children. We raise issues for debate. We, we basically all our work is to protect all children under the age of 18, but a great part of our work is also to work with families, since in an Indigenous approach, you cannot really separate children from their families. So if we take the next slide to give a little context to what Greenland is like we are very, very large island, but very, very few people. We have like 88% of Inuit living in Greenland, and our area is like 2,166,000 square kilometers, and only around 84% 84% of the landmass is covered by ice, so we can only live in the coast. So we mainly live in small towns and rural settlements. So basically, it's a one big rural place, I can tell you. And we don't really have we don't have any trains, and we can't go by car to another city. So coming around to the different kind of communities can be really, really difficult. And it also means that many of the isolated towns and communities are very specific in their culture. Lots of people think that there is one Inuit Greenland culture. There is not. We have many, many different kind of subcultures around. We have fishing and hunting and administration in Greenland mostly, and we receive a great deal of money from Denmark still, since we are not independent, but we have indigenous self-government as part of being a colony of Denmark. Next, please. So many of the problems that we deal with in Greenland in terms of women and children, girls in particular, are very, very much alike other indigenous societies. And when I started in this institution as the leader, for years we had seen many, many efforts where they tried to work with the rights of the children and the families, social issues, but that never worked. Mainly, Greenland has been trying to work with European copied models, and somehow they just never worked. Our numbers for sexual abuse and violence has stayed the same for many, many, many years. And also the approaches being used has been very much that in this way of, in the mindset that it can only be real research if you deal with numbers. So the whole thing about going to the places to work with the people, to work with the women, children, the families, by talking to them and listening to them is something that hasn't been done really in Greenland. And that is something that we have tried to change, and that is what I will say a little bit about. We have developed an indigenous model on how to work with children and youth in the small rural communities. So I will tell you a little bit about that. Next slide, please. So for the last years, we have traveled to 40 cities and settlements in Greenland to have open dialogues and to work with different kind of methods coming to each place. We have used and developed a new method at the same time while we were there, because we had to look at the whole foundation from each place before we could begin to develop a model that could be used in different Inuit communities. And why did it take 5 years to go to 40 cities and settlements? That is because we are only 6 women, but I will say a lot of 6 women. And we have been around over 600 kilometers, mainly by boat, on icy waters and mountains. So it is not just something that you just do. and particularly not with the lack of funding. And coming to the places, it was very yeah, it's been quite amazing to see how people since the colonial times, even though we have an indigenous or native government, are not used to being a part of the dialogues and not being part of being the participators in the whole processes being done. They are kind of used to politicians coming to the places, telling them about their plans, and leaving again. And the way they approach the communities would be like, you make an open dialogue, like, you can come and meet us tonight. And who will come to the meetings? That would be the informal and formal leaders, and mainly men. So the real problems of the small places don't really come up in this way. Next, please. Yeah. So what we have done is that we have worked on methods to adapt to each location. And we have worked on very, very much in order, how do we meet them in a respectful way, and how do we get beyond the various degrees of taboo, because there are many kinds of taboo from each places. Each place have their own collective cultural values and norms, and the way they are depending on each other can be very different. For example, in one community or small community, the sexual abusers can be the ones you are dependent on in terms of income or in terms of food or housing. Or in another community, it could be the teachers making the abuse in the children, and no one wants to say to the government about what is going on. So what we see is that people, or the growing up, protecting themselves instead of protecting the children. So by beginning to doing this in a different way, where we begin to go beyond the real truth, so say, has been really struggle for the first years. We have had to we've been through attacks from local people, mainly men. Why do you come here? There's nothing wrong here. And male men who are being hit in their old power structures, informal power structures, but also local politicians, because of they have been part of the problem for many years. So we also got attack from local politicians, but also, and even at the administration level, we have had police, we have had social workers, politicians who's been hiding knowledge about sexual abuse because they are family or interdependent. So in the few years, we had to deal with quite of hard attacks on us while we were traveling as well. Next, please. This is just a picture to show you an example from a small village where there is a lot of sexual abuse, and abuse has been going on for several generations. The children don't talk about it, and the grown-up absolutely don't talk about it. And this is just an example of if they don't talk. So then we have to adapt our way of reaching them. If we use Western models of trying to make them speak about something that is so shameful, we never make them talk. So we speak their language and work in their language. I cannot go into that. That would be too, that would take a lot of time if I am to explain it here, what we do exactly on each places. Next, please. So what we have, the kind of data we have collected are not numbers. These are voices. We have collected voices. And it's official. It is official in Greenland that 1 in 3 girl has been sexually abused. But what we found here by using this new method is that there are also dark numbers. So I cannot say how much more than 1/3, but we found dark numbers which are not being, how do you call them, when you don't report about them. So what we have seen and heard here from 40 cities and communities is that there are so many children who are subjected to sexual assault but receive no help. There was also physical and mental violence, and also, of course, as many people already know, with serious abuse problems. But one of the things that's been taken as a big shock when we began to bring up these things to our own government and our community is that the authorities' help for these children were not there at all or came too late. I once had a girl coming in. She's been trying to commit suicide. She's been trying to go to the municipality and nothing helped. Then she came in to me and showed me her cutting. She cut herself and said, "Aviya, do you believe me?" So that is the kind of girls that we sometimes meet. No one believes them, but everybody knows, but nobody do anything. Next, please. It's so bad that it's been going on for generations. We even found that there are words of "you will get used to it." That there are even words that are being used to these girls that they will get used to it. It's kind of a normalization. It's been really, really shocking. And although we hear about it, once you hear the words, it's so much worse. And because everybody is so dependent on each other to survive. And I have to say that the difference between rich people and poor in Greenland is very, very, very high. If you meet indigenous Greenland people going to the UN meetings, you probably meet the ones who do well. It's because you haven't met the one in the small communities who really, really don't have any money and are really depending on each other. And that is always the thing that our own government, very male government, always show Greenland to the world. But the story is another story when you ask the women and the girls. Next, please. So I'll be finished soon. I know I'm taking a little bit too time. So what we have discovered by using this new method is that there's a great gap between the rights of the child and what is actually the reality of the children and the young people's lives. And there is a lot of underreporting, and poverty is rampant, but it's particularly underreporting because indigenous small families are depending on each other is something that that's really serious. And there is even an anxiety about reporting, but if you don't do the reporting, you do not get the help, which is a right. And another thing is that because there are so few being reported, many times help only comes after several suicide attempts. So next please. This is just to quote, this is a quote I have from a 14-year-old girl. So this is just to give you an example of the difference of talking to the people or to talking about who it is about rather than just thinking in numbers. It gives a very, very different content. So the voices of the girls and the women are very, very strong. So that is basically what we have done for the last 5 years. And we had not been able to get the voices and bring them to the communities and also to the politicians if we had not tried to make our own indigenous method in order to get these things up. Next, please. So why does it work? Well, we try as much to go beyond the taboos, because the taboos in the small rural communities are the reasons to why grown-ups are much more protected than children. And if we don't break the taboos in the small places, it cannot secure help for these abused children. So we adapt instead of making local people adapt like they tried to make us do for the last 300 years of colonization. We always have to adapt. And if we don't do that, it is us always us being something wrong about. So here we take the courage. We have taken the courage to adapt, but we also have taken the courage to speak loud about this, although we are indigenous ourselves. And also, I think that a great part of the why it also works is that we do not have language and cultural barriers to the people we speak with. For many times, it's always been people coming from outside trying to look at these solutions. So next, please. So after 5 years of using this model, now we see that we have gone through a very tough time bringing all these things up. But we have turned it around now. We have all the political parties, all of them. We just had election. All of them, they are in support of this. So children's rights has recently been included in a new legislation, and the municipalities who were very much against us have begun to incorporate the recommendations that we have brought from the communities to them. And also we see that we begin to see that government and municipalities begin to see that it's necessary with a holistic approach to the whole family and the whole thing about coming further, because the whole Western way of individualizing the child away from its family, take the problem away from the community, has been a mistake that's been done for ages. And now we finally have a national strategy for sexual abuse prevention and help. Next, please. So what happened after we got a grant from Thriving Women? Well, first of all, we have seen a huge international and national interest in the model we worked on, because people could begin to see the difference, and they are breaking taboos. People are beginning to speak loud about it. But the thing is that although there's a huge interest, we are only 6 Indigenous women working in the office, and we have to travel around the country. So we haven't had any resources in order to document this kind of method. It's only by word and experience. But by getting a grant from Thriving Women, we have secured that this documentation now can happen, and it's being written into a book these days. So this book will be published in the autumn. It will be in Greenlandic, so that the other people in Greenland can begin to use the way of working. But it will also be in English, so that other Indigenous communities around the world can begin to try to look at the model and try to see if they can use it in their communities. And because we got the support from Thriving Women, support has also opened up for new cooperation and even more respect also, because the thing that we get grant from other countries is something that people look up to very much in Greenland. But money is money, but nothing is money. Nothing is money. I think that what we got most from our grant is that other women believed in us. We are giving hope, and we are giving motivation from other Indigenous women. This is the biggest gift and the biggest support that we have got, that we are very, very much grateful for. So thank you very much. I don't hope I was I took too much of your time.
Aviya, really appreciate as it has been noted in the chat, just you sharing your story, the story of people in Greenland and the work that you all are doing, and to really point to healing and hope, as you mentioned. So, now I'd like to introduce Mahin Colleen. Mahin is Deputy Director at Grantmaker for Girls of Color, which she joined in August of last year. Welcome, Mahin.
Thank you, everyone. And just, I have to say, I'm in deep awe, Aviya, of your work, and have so much respect for you, for Tia, for Maria, for Charlene, and for, of course, my dear sister, Teresa. So my name is Mahin. I am the Deputy Director at Grantmakers for Girls of Color. And we work to amplify and mobilize resources to support transformative organizing work that is led by and centers girls and gender expansive youth of color in the US and territories. And I just have to say that, Charlene, I read the report that Data for Indigenous Justice put out last night, and want to just encourage people to take time, as someone who comes from and has supported a lot of survivors, particularly of trafficking, exploitation, and MMIW. I think the report really beautifully frames the conversations we need to be having and the role of research and the importance of decolonizing research. So I just wanted to say that. So Grantmakers for Girls of Color, we really came out of and as a response to movement leaders, particularly women of color and Indigenous women and girls who were calling on philanthropy to more effectively respond to and resource girls and gender expansive youth of color. And so we started as a funder learning community seeded by a number of foundations. Many folks on this call were actually part of our early convenings and strategizing. And then became a fiscally sponsored project of the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors in August of 2019, and hired our first executive director, Dr. Monique Morris, in April of 2020. So I say all that to say that we are on the shoulders of many ancestors who have been building this work for many years, and also are relatively new as our own organization. And at G4GC, we really try to think about what we call reciprocity as praxis. So what does it mean as funders to engage in strategies that really do embody reciprocity? How do we think about the various ways that we resource our communities, not just from a transactional place and not just with money, but with camaraderie, with research, with convening, and with sisterhood and siblinghood is really how we try to think about this work. And in particular, we also have a lot of conversations about what it means to return to the ancestral ways that our communities have always practiced philanthropy. And most recently, we launched a youth advisory committee and design team. And one of the members is a young woman from Hopi. And when we asked her, what does philanthropy look like in your community? She talked about taking care of her elders. She talked about bringing food to people. She talked about making sure that people in the context of COVID had access to ceremony, even if people couldn't gather in the ways that they traditionally would. And for us, a lot of what we try to do is encourage philanthropy to take the time to better understand how girls and women in Indigenous communities and other communities of color are actually engaged in very active philanthropy all the time. And it is their philanthropic practices that have actually allowed communities to survive the multiple forms of violence that we have heard about so acutely and tenderly today. So one of the things that we did when Monique became our executive director in April of 2020 was that obviously it was in the midst of a recognition around the global pandemic. So we very quickly mobilized to launch a COVID-19 response fund called the Love is Healing Fund. We were able to move about $3 million to 140 organizations in the US, and in 29 states in Washington, D.C., and have recently brought in Guam and Puerto Rico, as well as as places where we fund work. And I will say that we, thanks to Tia's leadership and Teresa's leadership as two people who serve on our advisory board, we're able to move money to organizations that center Indigenous girls and women. And I wanted to just name really humbly for other funders on the call that are thinking about funding this work, just some of the learnings that we've had, particularly as we've been really excited to explore a deeper partnership with the Thriving Women's Program at the Seventh Generation Fund, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. The lessons that I think, one of the first lessons that I think has been really important for us is a lesson around language and the importance of making sure that as we frame our grant making opportunities and try to reach Indigenous girls and women and ensure that they see themselves in our grant making opportunities, it's important for us to think about the language that we use. It's also important for us to think about the framing. So Tia gave us the beautiful image of a basket. And for us, it's important to understand that, for example, if we're only looking for organizations that directly support girls and no one else, then we might be missing really important intergenerational work that is happening in communities. Or if we're looking for a particular kind of organization and we're missing the community spaces where people are learning about culture, about connection, about the earth, that we're also missing opportunities to really meaningfully resource this work. And so an important learning for us, one of the first important learnings has been really thinking about language and the language that we use and making sure that as we make these opportunities available, we are in conversation with Indigenous women and girls about the appropriate ways to frame the kinds of resourcing that we want to do. And similarly to that, I think another important learning and offering is around trust and relationship building. That in order to be in right relationship, as Tia is charging us to do, we have to really think about what it means to build trust, particularly because not only, as Teresa highlighted, are Indigenous women and girls vastly under-resourced, even in comparison to other women and girls of color, but also that much of the capital that philanthropy is sitting on is actually extracted from Indigenous communities. And is actively being extracted from Indigenous communities and contributing to the violence. So part of the right relationship is the naming, as Teresa offered and called us to do. And part of the right relationship is about thinking about moving at a speed that allows us to build trust and relationship and showing up in ways where we are really challenging the idea that, Teresa named this, philanthropy has made it very clear in many ways that they do not, that it as an institution does not trust women and girls, particularly Indigenous women and girls and other women and girls of color. And so for us, part of our work is to acknowledge that and to figure out how we can demonstrate that we do trust through general operating support, through not forcing organizations that are doing this work and entities that are doing this work to language their work in a way that suits our needs, but actually allowing them to tell us what they do and for us to trust that what they are doing is right for their communities. And so that's another place and important thing. And then the third thing is really that part of being in right relationship is using our own relationships, proximity, to move more resources to Indigenous communities. And so that's why we're really very honored and excited to explore a deeper partnership with the Thriving Women program that will particularly support organizations and entities that are engaged in cultural healing, engaged in ensuring that Indigenous girls that are doing work or learning about land and earth have access to resources, that are supporting the research, the decolonized research that the work that Charlene is doing is such a beautiful example of. And that most importantly, we are offering a container for more Indigenous girls and women to be in community with each other. It's something that the Thriving Women's program, as evidenced by, I think, Aviya's presentation today, has been able to do is really bring Indigenous peoples from all over the world together, and to continue to illuminate all of the similarities and experiences and the unique and important differences in the experiences of different communities and different places. And so I just want to call on my philanthropic colleagues to be in community with us as we explore these partnerships, and to take the time and to reach out to. I think I will say that Seventh Generation has been incredibly generous in terms of being a guide and answering questions and helping and advocating within philanthropy to help us think about our responsibility to Indigenous communities and how to continue to learn in important ways. And so I'm just deeply honored to be on this journey with Seventh Generation and the Thriving Women program, and deeply, deeply honored to be a part of this conversation today.
Wadell Mahin, thank you for laying out what you did around being a part of this work and how to go about it in a good way. I'd like to introduce our final speaker. Amanda Kostler is a philanthropist, and as Tia mentioned, the initiating donor of Thriving Women. Welcome, Amanda.
Hello, everyone. Wow, I'm this happened to me last time on the Flickr Fund. I was like speechless, and moved like from the soul level around this work, and thinking about a donor perspective, an individual white woman born into wealth, extractive capitalism, colonizing wealth, 5 generations out from that. My relationship to this work from my position. And I think the phrase, how to be a good ancestor, is like something that I use. It's like now a mental pattern. Thank you, Tia. Around assessing like my position in this world. And Thriving Women is doing everything and more, like way more than one individual donor could ever do. And Seventh Generation Fund, the accumulation of knowledge, wealth, of respect, of community, of relationships is far, far more than money. But it needs money, right? It needs circulation. And I keep coming back to that word, like, what is circulation, right? Yeah. And talking to Hester and Tia before this call, I've been reflecting just on like my own family experience, coming from a family of capitalists, and how very far away they are from relationship to communities. That's what money does. It takes you out of relationship. And for me, being a donor, it's about going into my family and educating them. So it's the personal education. Coming into relationship with this group has been mind-blowing. Absolutely a game changer, a worldview changer. And any donor who has the opportunity, the privilege to come into relationship here, I highly recommend. It will change your life in a thriving way. You'll find thriving in it. Because the more that we give from accumulated wealth, the more the decumulation happens in a real way, the more donors come into relationship with community. So it's healing. And that is what I have gotten from being a part of this community. I also want to acknowledge Genji Cook, a Mohawk midwife who coined the term "women as first environment," and she has been a huge influence on me. I'm a midwife, by the way. That's part of my many roles. And she's been an influence in birth justice, for sure, for many people probably on this call. She's like at the foundation of Thriving Women's Initiative. And I am just watching, like, that's like blooming out with all of the work. And it's such intense work. It's like we have a long road ahead of us of work. And just what you were saying, Teresa, about the 2.6%, what it, like, just even getting that to 10%, what that would do. So I'm leaving this call, this briefing, more committed to making that happen in the long term. Like, I am just in this for long term, moving my own family, educating my children. Every, like what Mahin said, where are your points that you can actually like leverage dollars and resources to this value system I'm committed to for my life. So I thank you all so much, and my heart is with you.
Widow Amanda, thank you for sharing your personal experience of why you're in this much larger body of work, and speaking to that. There's so much that's been shared in the last bit of time, and I find myself buoyed by these examples of thriving and healing in our communities. As Amanda mentioned, there is so much more that needs to be done, and the panelists who are in the work certainly spoke to the breadth and depth of what still needs to happen. But I just have such tremendous hope around the resilience of our communities to continue on in ways that continue to be good and reflect our ancestors' dreams and help us to move forward in good ways that allow us to really be good relatives and good ancestors. So Widow, to everyone for sharing your words and your experience. It's really an honor to be a part of this. Just a couple of closing announcements before we start to wrap up. I just want to remind folks to stay tuned for information on the next Voices Around the Circle webinar. That topic will be traditional healing. And just to take you through a couple of things, I'd like to share a poem, and this is by Linda Hogan. She's a Chickasaw poet, and the name of the poem is Landing. And then we'll go through a closing exercise. Landing. It is the day of leaving, when spiderlings in orders of magnitude hatch and from inward silk unfurl toward a new god caught by the wind. I walk by the silk curtain of strands that come from a body. It is a shining world. I want to unravel something from the belly of myself. It would not be about the spider who crossed water and brought fire back to my people, or even the length and brightness of our river, shining like silk in the light of sun and moonlight, but about the cave up there in the high mountains with animals made of willow twigs. They were there before us, tied with the string of our grasses, as if they were saying, "We are one of you, the future." And then those first ones came down on ropes of animal hair. They have always been the far travelers coming down from above. That's why our fields are full of hope. And what is a story but this? Silk, the ancestors landing and traveling who knows where, but sometimes they take your arm and caught on a soft wind, you follow. Widow, until we meet again, enjoy the rest of your day in whatever time zone you may be in. Be well.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to each of our presenters. Thank you, Hester, for guiding us through our conversation today. To Amanda, Geo Family Foundation, Grantmakers for Girls of Color, Hope Mountain, Humboldt Area Foundation, Calliopeia Foundation, Moon Jaguar Strategies, Ms. Foundation for Women, Solidar Network, and the Tamalpais Trust. To all of you, travel well, be safe, much love.